Buenos dias, everyone. We've got a doozy today, so I'm just going to jump right in. When it comes to ethical philosophy, Immanuel Kant is simply one of the most essential and influential thinkers there is. His writings about practical reason, morality, human freedom, these have been blueprints upon which many a contemporary ethical theory begins. And whether one is building on what Kant wrote or striving to dunk on the man, we would be irresponsible if we tried to skip past him. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This thing is hard to read. Kant has his own language, which is technical and dense, and it's translated from German, which means that there will always be something lost in translation when we're reading it in English. But despite these technical limitations or barriers to understanding, Kant really has something to say about ethics and something that really speaks to us today. Now, we might begin by asking why he would use such technical language when writing about morality. What purpose is this language serving? Kant's purpose for writing about morality at all has an impact on his answer to that very question. For Kant, it really needs to be determined whether or not ethics is a matter of custom and culture, or if it is a matter of some kind of inviolable law. In other words, is ethics really just etiquette, or is it part of the essential way that a human being exists? And how we answer that question is going to determine a lot about what morality is at all. See, Kant eventually wants to write an entire ethical treatise, like a big system or something close to it. And he does this in a later work called The Metaphysics of Morals. And this work includes a bunch of prescriptive elements. Basically, Kant wants to tell you how he thinks you should live your life, and he doesn't think he's able to do this without establishing what makes morality, well, moral. So, the purpose of the work that we are reading, the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals, is that it is a text designed to establish first principles. If Kant can't establish first principles, then he might as well just write whatever he darn well pleases, because the difference between doing the right thing and folding a napkin correctly will be negligible. This is why in today's video we're going to be tackling the first two chapters of Kant's Groundwork. In order to do that, we'll walk through some of the key concepts and the historical context before moving on to the main arguments of chapters 1 and 2. And really I'm going to focus heavily on chapter 2 because that's the big show of argument. The rest of the book hinges on that. So, without further ado, let's get at it. Kant is writing in the late 1700s within the context of a particular tradition of philosophy that was popular in Germany at the time, even though it wasn't Germany at the time. Google it. See, philosophy had become a bit more technical since the writing of Aristotle, and in order for Kant to begin the groundwork, he has to situate the kind of thinking that goes into ethical philosophy. What Kant is looking for in the text is a foundation for obligation. What provides us with the reasoning behind being obligated to do any particular action or to be connected to others? And he says that we can't ground this obligation in the circumstances or culture that we find ourselves in or in our own sense of happiness, because these are too fickle. Instead, he's looking for sources that you can base your ethical system on that are essentially rules that you act because of. Now, that's weird. You act for the sake of these rules. A rule that you act for the sake of that motivates you to do something. See, most rules we end up just conforming to because somebody asked us to, and it's less of a hassle to just do it the way that they want rather than because we think it's a good idea. But what Kant wants is to find the rule that is both something that motivates us to conform to it and also is a good idea. And so his goal in the groundwork is to uncover the supreme principle of morality, or the rule that is a good idea and that upon which or for the sake of which we act. So, light stuff. Anyway, to recap, the big thing we have to keep in mind is that we cannot expect ourselves to be able to rely on culture or some general idea of human nature to be the reason why a thing is moral. Instead, we have to dig deeper, we have to get more specific, and in order to do that, we are going to have to talk about William. When we talk about ethics, we are often talking about a particular kind of ethical philosophy, focused on what we would call moral normativity. Now, normative ethics are the branch of ethics that are concerned with the construction of rules for conduct. So, for Kant, moral judgments are normative. They act as rules of conduct or they reinforce conduct, provided that they are motivating. They motivate us to engage in this behavior. If they aren't motivating, they aren't normative, they're just wishful thinking. And so Kant assumes then that his readers will agree with him that there is nothing that is good without condition, nothing that is unconditionally good except for a good will. But what does Kant mean by will? Well, will is the manifestation of reason in its practical form. It is our cognitive power directed specifically at acting within the practical sphere, namely ethics and morality. So, will is a power that humans have to perform particular rational activities, which Kant holds to be the rational activity of acting morally. Long story short, will is how we ethics. A good will acts in accordance with the principle of morality, with this sort of supreme one rule to rule them all, aka the best rule, and because of this, it is good. But what is it that motivates this goodwill to act? It's one of three things, Kant says. It's either duty, direct inclination, or indirect inclination. Now, Kant provides us with a few examples of these different motivations, and they end up being helpful when thinking about what is and isn't genuinely moral. The first example he provides is that of an honest shopkeeper. Now imagine that a grocery store clerk who catches you before you leave the store tells you, hey, you overpaid for some of your items, and hands you a check for the difference. Now this seems like a moral thing to do, but Kant says not so fast. The shopkeeper is taking into consideration what their reputation will be, and if they have a reputation for being honest, that's going to help them in the long run because people are going to say their prices are fair and you should go there. They're not going to overcharge you, and everything that they do in terms of your economic interaction with them is basically going to be the sort of thing that you are going to expect from an honest shopkeeper. Now, in like manner, if a person enjoyed being helpful to others or performing acts of charity because of this enjoyment, they would be acting out of direct inclination. The honest shopkeeper is indirect inclination. The charitable giver is the direct inclination. It's not done out of duty to some ethical good. It's because you feel good about doing things that make other people feel better or help them. So a moral action, then, Kant says, can't be motivated simply by sympathetic feelings or good intentions, regardless of the long-term benefit we might receive or because we might be engaged in reputation management. So what is it that can make an action moral? Kant tells us that the worth of an action, lies not in its intention or purpose, not in what we want to do or the goal we are tending towards, but in its maxim, not like the magazine. A maxim is a rule or a principle that is the basis upon which you act. Feelings don't make an action worthy. Rules do. And what Kant is looking for is the rules that you follow out of duty. A duty is not just a special kind of purpose either. A duty is an entirely different foundation for ethics. See, the needs of others lay a claim on us, and that establishes a normative demand that one ought to help them. This ought is key. A moral ought combines both the motivation and the explanation for an action. For Kant, the reason the good-willed person does an action and the reason the action is good are one and the same. The maxim that they use is what guides them. Now, maxims have a legal character to them. They are normative statements that are law-like in and of themselves. Now, I know this sounds weird, but it'll make sense in a bit. Just follow me with this. The law-like form, the actual form of a maxim or practical rule, is what provides it with reason-giving force, and thus the motivation for being followed. In other words, a maxim is a rule of conduct that we ought to follow because it has the same shape and structure as the very foundation of morality itself. And this is what brings us to chapter 2. See, chapter 2 is where most of the work happens. Here, Kant is talking about the legal character of rules and how they're connected even more strongly to what he means by doing ethical actions. Kant begins by claiming that we cannot derive our ethics from examples, so bye-bye Aristotle. Examples must be vetted as to whether or not they are good. And here Kant is agreeing with that critique of Aristotle that following bad examples can end up meaning that unethical behavior is valorized. Ethics has to go deeper than that. Examples can encourage us, but they cannot justify our actions. And as a result, we need something to base our actions on, something more substantial. And here's where Kant really gets going. He starts by claiming that everything in nature operates according to laws. What he means here is like physical laws, like what one would find in, Sir Isaac Newton. And only a rational being has the capacity to act in accordance with principles or laws. In other words, only a rational being has a will. A will is that capacity which can choose only that which reason, independent of any inclinations, feelings, culture, peer pressure, etc., cognizes as good. A representation of the objective principle that we're talking about is called an imperative or an ought. As in, if one wants to walk without tripping, one ought to tie one's shoes. Imperatives are formulas that express the relation of objective laws to subjective imperfection or the subjective imperfection of the will. Using human words, we might say that what an imperative is a thing that tells us how we connect our imperfect human lives to the moral ought from the perspective of objective reason. But what makes it objective, and how do we even know that it is objective at all? Well, for Kant, he says there are two kinds of imperatives. The first kind, hypothetical imperatives, are really just a kind of practical necessity of a possible action as a means to an end. So they involve skills, right? Like if you are a parent, you ought to learn how to put a diaper on, or, how to heat up a bottle without scalding, your baby's mouth. Um, but these hypothetical inclinations, or hypothetical imperatives, sorry, are also based on assertions, which is essentially saying that they're based on what you would do if you wanted to be happy. So if you want to relax, you ought to use a bath bomb. A categorical imperative is something else entirely. See, categorical imperatives contain only that which is necessary for a maxim to be in conformity with law. Remember, Kant says that morality is founded on the law-like form of our ethical rules. If the rules don't align with the proper form, they are quite literally deformed and can't be moral. They're bent out of shape. Only that which is correctly aligned with the form of law can count as being morally motivating and an ought that ought to be followed. Kant then gives us a few different formulations of the categorical imperative, and they all take a very similar structure but change certain elements. So the main formula that he uses is this: act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it would become a universal law, or as though it was a universal law of nature, or as though you treat someone as an end in themselves and not as a means, or in relating all action to the making of laws that make possible a kingdom of ends. What do all of these mean? Well, let's get into that. They're all related to the categorical imperative. And a categorical imperative is categorical insofar as it applies to all rational beings unconditionally. It has a kind of universality and unconditionality element to it. So, if something applies in all cases, we might say it is a universal law. It has universality. It is not distinguished by who and who it doesn't apply to. A universal law of nature, then, is basically Kant doubling down on the idea that universal laws of morality function at the same level of universality as laws of nature do, like gravity. So, ethics are really important. Now, where Kant really gets going is with his formulations that discuss the means and ends and the kingdom of ends. See, human beings, for Kant, are objective ends that have absolute worth. I want to pause and repeat that, because this is a really key line from Kant. Human beings are ends in and of themselves, and therefore have objective worth. For Kant, this formulation leads to several conclusions. No suicide, no lies, and I must treat every other rational being as though they are an end in themselves. If the ends of others must also be my end or goal, because what applies to me applies to them, then we all need to act as though we are living in a kingdom of ends. To explain the kingdom of ends, we should think about what Kant says regarding rational beings, where rational beings are both members and heads of the kingdom of ends. We both make and are subject to universal laws of morality. Now, we have to think about whether or not our actions are universalizable, or whether they're just for our own edification and enjoyment. But we also have to think about whether or not we are going to submit to those rules which are formulated by others. Are the rules that we establish going to be the sort of thing that others ought to conform to? Or are we just demanding that others conform to our moral preferences? So where does that leave us? Well, At this point in chapter 2, Kant hasn't fully articulated the relationship between the categorical imperative and freedom. And if anything, it sounds like he's basically laid out an argument for the categorical imperative, and it's based on one big if. If you want to be ethical, if you want to be rational, then you will act this way. But if you don't care about that, what's to stop you from acting otherwise? Now, to answer this question, we'll have to dip into chapter 3, but that will have to wait for another video. Adios.